This is Mrs. Love, and I'm going to be reading for you the book Manifest Destiny and the Journey West. Chapter 1, A Nation Expands. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, thousands of people in the United States moved west. Some rode in wagons or stagecoaches, but most traveled by water. Many people followed the Missouri River. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had used this route during their expedition to explore the new territory. In the early 1800s, steamboats made it easier for people to travel and settle along rivers. However, this land was not empty. It belonged to American Indian nations. Before 1815, the U.S. government had treated these nations like separate countries. But that began to change. Nationalism was growing. U.S. leaders did not respect or value American Indian cultures. They treated American Indian land like it was part of the United States. During the 1820s and 1830s, the U.S. government forced many American Indian tribes out of areas where white people wanted to settle. First, tribes on the Great Plains, such as the Osage and Kansa, were forced to give up some of their land. Next, the U.S. government forced tribes from farther east to move to that land. It became known as Indian Territory. Many American Indian tribes were driven from their land near the Great Lakes. For example, the Shawnees were forced to leave their homes in Ohio. They moved west of the Mississippi River. The Osage lived in areas that would become Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Other nations soon followed, including the Chippewa, Miami, and Potawatomi. American Indians in the southeast lost their land as well. The Choctaws, Creeks, Chickasaws, Cherokees, and Seminoles were forced to sign a series of treaties and move west to Indian Territory. This new land was very different from the land they left behind. In addition, many tribes were forced to live together in small space. In some cases, fighting broke out between American Indian nations. Some members of the Great Plains tribes saw the tribes from the east as invaders. For example, the Osage tribe had lost hunting grounds. They fought against the Creeks, Choctaws, and Shawnees who moved to that land. Many other tribes felt their land had been taken unfairly. Settlers rushed to the areas where these tribes had once lived. Soon, their farms and towns stretched west of the Mississippi River. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was used to force nations such as the Seminoles to leave their homelands. Chapter 2, To the Pacific Northwest. By 1830, settlers had filled Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri. They were looking for more land, but just to the west was the Indian Territory, and beyond that was the Great Plains, an area thought to be a desert. Some settlers followed the Santa Fe Trail to Texas or New Mexico, but many looked all the way to the Pacific coast. The Hudson's Bay Company bought and sold fur at trading posts along the Pacific coast. Lewis and Clark had explored part of the Pacific coast in the early 1800s. They had reached the Oregon country in 1805, but the journey had been long and hard. Few U.S. settlers came to the Oregon country. Instead, most people who came there were fur traders or trappers. Many worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. This British fur trading company had many trading posts in the area. It also traded with local American Indian tribes such as the Nez Perce, Flathead, Snake, and Ute. In 1818, British and U.S. leaders had agreed that people from both countries could live in the Oregon country. But in the 1830s, more people from the eastern United States began traveling to Oregon. In 1831, 4 American Indians came to St. Louis, Missouri with fur traders. Their visit inspired missionaries to travel to Oregon. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman led one of the first groups in 1836. They planned to live near the Flathead tribe. Members of the Flathead Nation later lived in a reservation in Montana. They also encouraged settlers to come to Oregon. They wrote letters and journals describing their new home. As news of the Oregon country spread east, more people became interested in the area. The descriptions of fertile land appealed to farmers. Owning land was seen as a sign of wealth. Plus, the U.S. economy began to struggle in 1837. In the next few years, lots of people lost money. They decided to look for new opportunities in Oregon. People from across the United States began moving to Oregon. Some traveled by sea, but many followed a route that fur traders had used. This route became known as the Oregon Trail. Travelers had to cross approximately 2,000 miles of plains, deserts, and mountains. It was a long, hard journey. But by the 1840s, the trail was filled with wagons traveling west. You can look at the map here to see where the trail went. Chapter 3, On the Oregon Trail. The first group of wagons left Missouri in May 1842. A team of horses, mules, and oxen pulled each wagon. Most people walked alongside the wagons. One wagon could carry approximately 2,000 pounds. People packed food for the trip. They also brought tools for farming and building new homes. Wagons had to cross the Rocky Mountains to reach Oregon. The wagons traveled in small groups. A guide rode ahead and planned the day's route. Wagons could usually go 15 to 20 miles in one day. After traveling all day, people stopped to cook food and care for their animals. The first wagon train reached Oregon in October 1842. News of the success reached Missouri. Even more people were eager to move. A larger group set out in May 1843. This group brought 5 times as many U.S. settlers to Oregon. The settlers wrote letters home. They described the wonderful land. Thousands of more people moved to Oregon during the rest of the 1840s. People faced many dangers along the trail. They had to travel in rain, wind, and heat. Diseases killed many people, and wagons had to cross the mountains before winter. Otherwise, the trail would be blocked by deep snow. Travelers met American Indian tribes. Some tribes attacked wagons or stole horses, but others helped the travelers. Wagons on the Oregon Trail sometimes had to ford or cross a river. Settlers often traded with them for food or supplies. On the Great Plains, the settlers hunted buffalo until there were almost none left. Many tribes in this area depended on these animals for food. As more U.S. settlers reached Oregon, they began to want more U.S. government control. The British still claimed some of the land in the Oregon country, but they realized they could not keep U.S. settlers out. In 1846, they agreed to the boundary that separates the United States and Canada today. Other parts of the United States were growing too. Texas had been annexed in 1845, and people were eager for the United States to grow even more. Some wanted the country to expand all the way across North America. This idea became known as Manifest Destiny. And if you can look at the map, you can see the different colors are showing the different times in which the United States grew and took over more land. Voices from the Past, John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan was a newspaper editor. In 1845, he wrote articles in support of expanding to the West. He said the United States had a manifest destiny to spread across North America. In fact, he thought the country should eventually possess the whole of the continent. Like many U.S. citizens, O'Sullivan saw the United States as a model for other countries. He believed its form of government was the best possible kind. He called it the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government. By spreading across North America, O'Sullivan wrote, the United States would bring freedom and equality to many people. O'Sullivan originally thought people would choose to join the United States, but the term manifest destiny was also used to justify taking land by force. Some leaders claimed the United States was superior to American Indian nations. They used this idea as an excuse to push those nations off their land. As the United States expanded, tens of thousands of American Indians lost their homelands. And here's a picture of John O'Sullivan. He was the first person to use the term manifest destiny. Chapter 4, California and Gold. Around the time people started moving to Oregon, other settlers traveled to California. The first group set out in 1841. A few others followed, though not nearly as many moved to Oregon. This began to change in 1848. That year, a carpenter named James Marshall found gold near a mill that belonged to John Sutter. During the gold rush, 1 of every 100 people in the United States moved to California. Other workers found more and more gold, and the news began to spread. Many people left their jobs to look for gold near Sutter's mill. Even sailors and soldiers deserted their posts. The gold rush had begun. News of the gold traveled east. Soon, people from around the world rushed to California. Many traveled by boat. Some sailed all the way around South America. Others crossed the Isthmus of Panama. This made the trip much shorter. But travelers had to canoe up the Chagres River and cross 20 miles of mountains. And then they had to take another ship to California. Other gold seekers traveled by land. Many followed the California Trail, which ran through the slave state of Missouri. Many travelers from the northern states had never seen slavery firsthand before. Approximately 90,000 people had moved to California by 1849. In fact, so many settlers arrived at that territory applied to become a state. Lawmakers debated whether the new state would allow slavery. In 1850, they reached an agreement called the Compromise of 1850. It was made up of 5 laws that tried to keep the balance between free states and slave states. California became a free state. The United States now stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But to reach this goal, the U.S. government had pushed thousands of American Indians off their lands. U.S. officials forced people to sign unfair treaties. They broke promises to American Indian leaders, and they would break their promises again later. The U.S. government had said the move to Indian Territory would be permanent. They thought white settlers would not want to live on the land. But by the 1880s, that had changed. The U.S. government opened Indian Territory to white settlers. American Indians were pushed out. Once again, the idea of manifest destiny was used to take land. Okay, and here's questions if you want to read them, and some of the glossary terms and definitions throughout the book. You can pause the video if you would like to read those.